Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Now, make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Also, be sure to follow me on social media at P.A.S. Report and share this episode with 3 or 4 other people. We are back. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. And I'll tell you, there's never a dull moment under this administration. When I took the family to the Poconos for a few days last week, but before I left, I recorded an episode, had it all ready to go. The episode was going to focus on the massive fraud that we're witnessing, this scam of taxpayer dollars. I was going to talk about some of Nick Shirley's reporting on the Somali daycare centers and other fraud that's taken place. So everything was scheduled. Then on Saturday morning, everything changes. We see the takedown of Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela. And so the episode I originally had scheduled, that's now going to air on Wednesday, because when reports broke that Nicolás Maduro had been taken down in what amounted to a 90-minute operation, I cannot ignore that. There are a lot of implications, both domestically and internationally, and especially given what we've seen for the last few decades, because we've been conditioned that when we hear the words regime change, immediately, we think of forever wars. And we're talking about the endless deployments, trillions of dollars have burned, thousands of lives lost, soldiers coming back in flag-draped coffins. You have these vague objectives that shift over time, impossible to achieve. The failed policymakers continue to make failed policies. Let's be honest. What have we witnessed from the so-called foreign policy experts? Failure after failure after failure. And it all culminated in the biggest foreign policy debacle in American history. And I'm talking about Afghanistan, 20 years of war, and the Taliban is better armed and equipped today than it was on September 10th, 2001. It was an embarrassment. It severely weakened us on the world stage. We lost power and influence. It will go down in history as the worst foreign policy decision that we've ever made. So when reports broke that Maduro has been taken down, it stopped everyone cold. Something that we have to pay attention, because it was something we haven't seen before. This wasn't Iraq. It wasn't Afghanistan. It wasn't Libya. It wasn't some far-off Middle Eastern country. It was a country in our own hemisphere, a hemisphere that we have ignored for over 2 decades. And what didn't we see? And I think that's the key here. We didn't see years of a military buildup. We didn't see any mass mobilizations. We didn't hear any speeches about exporting democracy. We didn't see soldiers dying on a battlefield. We didn't see trillions of tax dollars being wasted. Instead, what we saw, at least based on what we know right now, what we saw was a tightly scoped mission. We saw precision operation with defined objectives, a defined endpoint. And it was a really risky campaign. If it failed, it would have destroyed the Trump presidency. There's no doubt about that. But like Operation Midnight Hammer, our military and intel units performed at such a high level. They perform with perfection. And it demonstrates why standards are so important. Why we have the most powerful military in the entire world. We pulled off something that most other, if not all other nations, wouldn't be able to do. So we need to recognize this moment. And it is historically significant because the operation was so impressive. But we can't get carried away here. It's important that we be a little cautious. It's important that I take the time to explain exactly what makes this different and why that difference matters. And we have to look at what happens next. We need to understand that success of an operation doesn't automatically translate into policy successes. We easily took down Saddam Hussein. We ousted him from power fairly quickly. It was the aftermath that became a problem. We took out the Taliban, right? We took the Taliban out of power. We limited al-Qaeda's capabilities. It was the aftermath that became the problem. Now, when it comes to Venezuela, we don't see immediate chaos in the streets. We don't see the immediate chaos in the aftermath of this operation. But that doesn't mean that consequences won't follow. That's why we got to pay attention. So here's where we are today. Maduro wasn't removed through some long campaign of bombing, boots on the ground, sanctions, layered on sanctions, multi-year efforts to collapse the Venezuelan state. This wasn't about regime transformation in the abstract. It was about removing one individual who sat at the center of a criminal and authoritarian system. And that distinction does matter. Maduro was given very generous offers, and he rebuffed them. In fact, there are reports that Trump and Maduro actually spoke a little bit over a week ago. And Trump warned Maduro to take what America was offering, otherwise there'll be consequences. Maduro called Trump's bluff. Unfortunately for him, Trump wasn't bluffing. And that's the difference between Trump and a lot of past leaders, past presidents. Now, it kind of reminds me of when George W. Bush told Saddam Hussein that he and his two sons, Uday and Qusay, must leave Iraq in order to avert a war. Saddam thought Bush was bluffing, and he paid the ultimate price for that. But that's where the similarities end. In Iraq, the mission expanded almost immediately, from removing Saddam Hussein to rebuilding an entire nation, rewriting its policies, trying to reshape its culture, try to stabilize a region that was unstable for centuries. In Afghanistan, we saw a similar trajectory, right? We see the nation building. We see the same vague objectives of democratization. In Libya, we took out Gaddafi. How well did that work out? What did Libya get in return besides chaos and slave markets? Far more people died when Gaddafi was removed from power than the 40 years that Gaddafi was in power. It's not to say Gaddafi was a good human being. It's not to say that Muammar Gaddafi was some type of virtuous leader. He wasn't. He was a thug. He was brutal in his rule, but he did provide an element of stability within Libya, and we'd be stupid if we ignored that. So in all those cases, the so-called policy experts, they made these assumptions, right? They assumed that we would be greeted as liberators. They assumed that all people prefer freedom over the idea of stability within their lives. They assume that all different groups will work in the best interests of their countries as opposed to what's in the best interests of their tribes. We assume that democracy is compatible with all cultures around the world. And the assumptions were always the same. All those assumptions, though, turned out to be wrong. Not just wrong, they came with deadly and severe consequences. They weakened the United States. And because of those assumptions, the subsequent failures, we lost a lot of power and influence on the world stage. And our adversaries were emboldened. So this operation is different based on what we know. It's not that we're going to go out and democratize Venezuela, at least not yet. We got to see where that goes. We didn't promise to fix corruption, restore democracy, and transform Venezuelan society. What Trump did was target the head of a regime. And what's more, President Trump announced that we will run the country and do what we believe is in our strategic interests and the interests of the Venezuelan people. He isn't rushing to put together some weak, artificial, transitional government that is going to ultimately undermine the United States, that undermines our interests, the kind of half-baked nation building that Washington has done over the course of the last 2 decades that actually leaves America weaker and less secure. And that alone represents a new shift in thinking. It represents a shift in how American power is going to be used. And let's be honest, this is exactly what Americans have been demanding for years. And many Americans don't know how to articulate it. And it's not to say that most Americans support the ouster of Maduro or not. But what we do know is that people are tired of forever wars, that they're tired of these constant blank checks, raping taxpayer dollars, adding to our national debt, mortgaging our future. They're tired of their political leaders who put vague notions and the interest of others before America and the American people. Now, again, it's not to say that this operation in the long term is going to be successful. The operation itself was successful. But what's the strategy going forward? And I'll get to that in a minute. However, I think most Americans would accept a 90-minute operation with 0 American deaths versus a 20-year war where we spend trillions of dollars and see thousands of lives lost, thousands of soldiers coming home in flag-draped coffins, tens of thousands of soldiers coming home with life-altering injuries. But I think more importantly, it raises an uncomfortable question for these so-called policy experts out there. Were the endless wars the result of necessity? Or were they really the result of a foreign policy class within our country that is so infected with hubris and had never, ever, ever had to pay the price for being catastrophically wrong time and time and time again? I will guarantee you that every single expert, the architects of Iraq, the architects of Iran, the architects of Libya, the architects of Afghanistan, I will guarantee you that if this proposal was put forth to them, they would have rejected it. They would have said it can't be done, that it's too bold, it's too ambitious. Instead, they would want to spend millions upon millions of more taxpayer dollars in democracy programs that go nowhere or an actual war with Venezuela. And before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not taking a victory lap here. And I don't think the Trump administration should take a victory lap. This is not a celebration. I'm providing analysis. I can't ignore how this approach avoided many of the disasters of past interventions of ours. There are risks involved, especially moving forward. And just because the operation was a success, we can't fall victim to the illusion that everything's now going to go smoothly in Venezuela from here on out. When something happens quickly and cleanly, unfortunately, it's tempting to believe it was simple. But it wasn't. Operations like these, they take extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary military precision, confidence. They require accurate assumptions, and they leave no room for error. You can't make any mistakes. If a mistake happened during this operation, it would have been catastrophic for the administration. But the real significance isn't just the takedown of Nick Maduro, a thug. It's not that Maduro's gone. It's not even that the United States demonstrated an awesome military capacity to act decisively without sliding into a prolonged multi-year conflict. The more important question is what happens next. That's going to be the significant. For years, American power has been grossly mismanaged, and all bureaucrats should have been held responsible for that. They should have been held accountable. This operation shows that there's another way, that you could have limited, targeted, and narrowly defined missions to achieve your objectives. And we need to see policy success, especially when it comes, because our military always performs exceptionally well. We always have success when it comes to military engagements. Where we fail, where Washington routinely fails, is when it comes to actual policy. And the real test isn't whether the United States can remove a dictator quickly and decisively. We've proven that we can. The real test is whether it can translate that success into a stable outcome, whether Venezuela emerges stronger and more aligned with U.S. interests as opposed to our adversarial interests, whether this increases our power and influence in the world and blunts the power of our adversaries. Too many people are focusing what's right in front of them. They're focusing on the here and now. Too many people retreat to their ideological corners. And this isn't about liking or hating a president. This is about a fundamental shift in how American power is being exercised. And for the first time in a long time, the United States acted without trying to remake the world in its own image, without apologizing for defending its own interests. That is such a break from the post-Cold War mindset that has dominated our foreign policy for decades. And we can't ignore the uncertainties that now exist. It's not whether the operation worked, it clearly did. It's about whether we are capable of turning this tactical victory into a lasting and strategic policy success. So when we come back, I'm going to talk about the challenges that we face, what this approach got right, where it could still go wrong, and why there is absolutely no margin for error going forward. So everyone, hang tight, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So now in this segment, I want to focus on what comes next. You know, this is where things begin to get a little bit more complicated. When President Trump held the press conference announcing the operation and the arrest of Maduro, he also made a statement that immediately set off alarm bells. And you heard the critics screaming. It raised serious questions, even among supporters, even amongst myself. He said the United States is effectively going to run Venezuela until there can be a safe and competent transition. Now, that's not a throwaway line. This is a profound departure from how the United States has handled regime change for decades. And we need a departure, right? Because, again, all we've seen was failure after failure. What happens when a dictator falls, that's where Washington screws everything up. That's where they historically fail. Because they don't understand the people they're working with, the cultures they're working with. They're lazy. They don't understand the dynamics of international politics. And it's not that we failed because we didn't have enough resources. It's not that we failed because we didn't have enough time. I mean, 20 years in a country, I would argue that's a pretty long time. The big part of our problem was that we failed because we empowered the wrong people. We accepted the wrong incentives. We acted surprised when the people we put in power, the people that used American support to get into power, ended up using that power to serve themselves and actually undermine the United States. In our past interventions, the problem was never that we moved fast and got out. We didn't get out. We remained. We stayed in Iraq for about 8 years. We stayed in Afghanistan for 20. So the problem wasn't speed. The problem was premature handoffs, handing power to people who were incompetent, people who were corrupt, sectarian, people who didn't like the United States and actually were hostile to the United States. No other nation will put someone in charge that goes against their own interests. And we did exactly that while we were committed on the ground, while we were still bleeding, still paying, still trying to achieve objectives that those same leaders that we installed did not share. And instead of making our job easier, the people that we put in power made our job more difficult. They turned American forces into their own security wing for the government that nobody really saw as legitimate, that had no competence. We saw that some of them actually liked the instability because it kept the money flowing. It kept Americans locked in. And let's talk about it plainly. Take Afghanistan. The United States elevated Hamid Karzai. They treated him like a partner. But Karzai didn't act like a partner. Karzai was a thug. He worked overtime to undermine the United States, both politically and strategically. He would publicly blame American forces for civilian casualties. He would stoke resentment amongst Afghanis towards Americans, and he positioned himself as a leader standing up to American occupation. And the kicker was that he was siphoning off the funds that we were giving him, putting it in his own personal bank account. His brother became one of the biggest drug dealers on the planet. His government depended on us for survival, and our stupid policymakers routinely allowed him to spit in our faces as opposed to take him to the woodshed. Karzai tried playing both sides because it benefited him. And that's the dirty little truth of these arrangements. As Karzai routinely spit in our face, made things more difficult for America and Americans, he would demand more resources, more protection, more funding. And our stupid policymakers would give him whatever hell he wanted, even as Karzai was spewing anti-American rhetoric, even as he was putting targets on the backs of our soldiers. When we look at Iraq, we empowered Nouri al-Maliki. He was just as destructive as Karzai was in a little bit of a different way. Instead of building a national government, he entrenched sectarian rule. He marginalized rivals. He would capture, take over institutions. He tried to play internal power politics while American forces were still trying to stabilize the country. And he didn't just stumble into policies that hurt U.S. interests. He repeatedly made decisions that undermined us because his priorities were not American objectives. He wasn't looking out for what's in the best interests of America. He was looking out for what's in the best interests of himself and his groups. His priorities was his own power, his own faction. Just think of how most of the oil contracts in Iraq didn't flow to America, even though we were the ones that freed the Iraqis from Saddam Hussein's brutal regime. Most of the oil contracts actually flowed to our adversaries, Russia, China. We saw al-Maliki invite Iran to become a strategic partner, get more entrenched within Iraq as we were there, as Iranian IEDs killed American soldiers. And just like Karzai, al-Maliki would routinely spew anti-American rhetoric. So let's be clear about what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't leave quickly. We stayed. We outsourced political authority to people that hated us, people that didn't share our aims, and then we spent years trying to achieve stability as those leaders actively sabotaged the very foundation of stability that we were trying to build. And this is why Trump's approach, at least rhetorically, is such a significant departure. He's not saying, let's remove Maduro and immediately hand the country to a convenient committee of exiles and NGOs and hope for the best. He's saying that the United States is going to take responsibility for Venezuela until a transition could be done in a safe and competent manner. Now, that could be a very good thing because it acknowledges a reality that Washington, the so-called policy experts, they don't like to admit, that too often they care more about optics than what's actually in America's best interest. They don't want America to be viewed as imperialist, so we quickly hand over the keys to the country to people who can't govern effectively, people who totally undermine the United States and our interests, and people who actually despise us as opposed to seeing us as an ally. Now, with that being said, we also have to recognize that there's pitfalls in this strategy. And the first pitfall is mission creep. This is what I really fear. And it's not in the way people usually talk about it. When I say mission creep, I'm talking about the policymakers gradually redefining the mission because it serves their interests or because other problems emerge. I'm not talking about the expansion of military per se, a general requesting more troops and the theater of war expanding. I'm talking about what we saw following 9/11. The original mission was to remove the Taliban from power and degrade al-Qaeda's capabilities. We did that. We were successful. But then it morphed into turning Afghanistan into a vibrant democracy. Now, what the hell does that even mean, and what does that even look like? It's not simple. Can you really measure whether or not a viable democratic Afghanistan even exists? Is it something that's attainable or realistic? And can you do it in a timely fashion? But our so-called experts, they made America responsible for outcomes that were never part of the original mission, that the American people never truly signed up for. So what started out as security then became governance. Then it became rebuilding institutions. Then it became economic restructuring. Then it became trying to manage public sentiment. Then it became trying to change a culture. And suddenly, the United States is no longer overseeing a transition or working within its own interests. It's trying to run a society that doesn't want to be run by America. That is a surefire path to failure, not because America is incapable, but because you have all these political, cultural, and factional dynamics at play. The second pitfall is legitimacy. The longer that we run Venezuela, even temporarily, any hardship, even if the hardships are caused by decades of socialist mismanagement, they're now going to be blamed on the United States. So if you have power failures, well, it's America's fault. Food shortages, America's fault. May not be fair, but that's the reality, and we have to be aware of that reality. And if Venezuelans don't feel that their lives are improving, who do you think they're going to blame? Do you think they're going to blame Maduro, or do you think they're going to blame the United States? So we have to be very careful here. The third pitfall is probably one of the most important ones, and it's if we transition, and this is why I think Trump is correct when he says we're not going to rush to a transition. Why? Because if the transition is run by the wrong people, if it's handed over to the same class of bureaucrats and foreign policy lifers who have a track record of failure, nothing changes. If you transition the Venezuelan government and you put in corrupt officials, nothing changes. The mission expands, tax dollars will begin to get pumped in. Ultimately, it's going to weaken the United States. So the challenge wasn't removing Maduro. The challenge is building a structure that prevents a Maduro 2.0 from emerging. We don't want to see people from within the old regime. We don't want to see opportunists who present themselves as the acceptable alternative, and yet they're just as bad as Maduro and the socialists. We don't want to see the same corrupt playbook. And that's a challenge that we can't ignore. We have to do what's in America's interest. And we can't be worried about the potential political optics. And this is why there's no room for error, because one bad appointment, one corrupt intermediary, one premature concession to the wrong faction that exists, one misread of the political landscape, and the entire thing begins to unravel. It starts going sideways. So I'm going to say it as plainly as possible. The long-term success of this strategy depends on whether Washington can finally do what it has not consistently done for decades. They need to align the means with the ends. They need to select competent partners within Venezuela. They need to enforce accountability. They need to resist the temptation to pretend that slogans about democracy are a substitute for actual policy and actual governance. It's not necessarily about liberty and freedom. If the United States is going to oversee a transition, then it has to be a transition that's grounded in reality. We have to have a transition that's in our best interests, as well as the interests of the Venezuelan people. We cannot empower people who will use America to get rich and then stab us in the back. And that's exactly what happened in previous endeavors. You have Hamid Karzai that undermined us while we funded him. You have Nouri al-Maliki. He undermined stability as we were fighting for it. And the American people were told year after year after year that progress is being made. Progress is right around the corner. And what happened? It all collapsed in a spectacular failure. This time, the question isn't whether the takedown was impressive. It certainly was. This time, we can't afford to repeat the mistakes of the past. We can't afford to repeat the past interventions that turned into disasters. And when we come back, I want to pull back the curtain on something else because there's more here than just narco-trafficking storyline that you're hearing out there. When the president starts talking about oil infrastructure and strategic control, it becomes clear. This goes far beyond any arrest warrant. That's just a means to an end. There's more than meets the eye, so hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with 3 to 4 other people. And do me a favor. Give the P.A.S. Report podcast a 5-star rating. Leave a good review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And let's pull back the camera. Because if you're still thinking that this is primarily about narco-trafficking and overdose deaths here in the United States and the drugs that are pouring in and America's addiction problems, you are totally missing the point. Yes, narco-trafficking narrative, it's part of it. Not going to deny that. There are indictments and warrants against Maduro and his whole team, but that is simply the justification that was used to take Maduro out. It's not the actual motivation. It's the clean rationale, right? It's what makes it legal in a sense. And it makes the operation easier to sell. It makes it easier to defend and justify. But the real storyline is geopolitics. That's what this all comes down to. This was about the Western Hemisphere and whether the United States is going to allow hostile actors to keep building influence in our backyard, or whether we were going to finally say, hey, we've had enough, that this is an open territory and you better stay the hell out of our backyard. That's what this is really about. It's the reestablishment of the Monroe Doctrine. For decades, we've acted like the Monroe Doctrine. It's a relic of the past. It's something that's taught in history classes, not something that actually guides American strategy. And to a certain degree, they were right. Think about it. We've ignored our own hemisphere for what, 3 decades? And even before that, how many times did we actually screw up in our own hemisphere, make things actually worse? But in the last 3 decades, our focus has been on the Middle East, thousands upon thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, our adversaries actually saw a perfect opportunity. They understood that this is fertile ground to expand their spheres of influence. So what you've watched over the last several years is the steady, deliberate expansion of foreign influence in Latin America, not because those countries have things in common with them, not because those countries are obsessed with ideology. They don't care how these countries govern their own people. The reason they got here is because they saw an opportunity. They saw it was an opportunity to weaken us as our policymakers treated our own hemisphere as an afterthought. So they came in to fill a void. And in Venezuela, that's someone else. It's been a mix of state actors, shadowy groups and networks, terrorist organizations. I mean, let's start with the obvious. Russia. Russia has long viewed Venezuela as a strategic outpost. You have energy cooperation, arms relationships, influence operations, intelligence footprints. This is not new. It's been openly discussed for years. Russia and Venezuela even signed a strategic partnership agreement just last year, which included energy and military cooperation. You have China pouring tons of money into Venezuela through loans for oil arrangements, going all the way back to Hugo Chavez. And because we recognize that China doesn't just give out money because it's a charitable country, China gives out money for leverage. China does collateral, right? It does long-term positioning. You have these loan for oil deals and this large-scale Chinese financing. Do you think that they're not giving this money to Venezuela for a reason? And what do you think that reason is? Do you also think it's a coincidence that President Trump greenlit this operation on the same day that a Chinese diplomatic delegation met with Maduro just hours earlier? You know, Beijing doesn't show up in Caracas because it cares about the Venezuelan people. Beijing shows up because they see it's in Beijing's interest. Beijing shows up because they view Venezuela as a strategic asset. Its oil reserves, its infrastructure, its ports, its intelligence access, its location in our hemisphere. And when China sends diplomats, it isn't just diplomacy, it's a signal. This is our client. It's our investment. And we're going to exercise leverage over that investment. So when the United States moves immediately after that meeting, it's not random timing. It's a message loud and clear that the Western Hemisphere is not a free operating zone for the CCP, that America's done watching adversaries consolidate power right off our coast, and that we're not going to allow it anymore. When we turn our attention to Iran, they have spent years building relationships, access throughout the region, both directly and indirectly. And you add in Cuba and Cuba's intel apparatus that was charged with keeping Maduro safe. Obviously, they failed in that duty. But it's important to recognize that Maduro did not trust Venezuelans. So Cuban influence in Venezuela's security service has been a discussion for years because it's how Maduro was able to last for so long. It's about control. Then you have the non-state actors and a threat that's been ignored for years. I'm talking about the proxy ecosystem that exists. You take a group like Hezbollah, Hamas, perfect examples. You know, when most Americans hear Hezbollah and Hamas, what do you think of? Well, you think of Islam, you think of the Middle East, but Hezbollah's fundraising and logistic networks in Latin America have been a documented concern for years. It's been documented. You take the former Venezuelan vice president, Tariq al-Assami. He was born in Venezuela, but he had a whole bunch of ties to Middle Eastern terror networks. He was involved in drug trafficking. He was the vice president of Venezuela from 2017 to 2018, served as the Minister of Industries and National Production from 2018 to 2021, became the Minister of Petroleum from 2020 to 2023. That matters. It matters because it tells you that the hemisphere we're living in, it's not just a chessboard for states. It became a playground for criminal and terror-linked finance and logistics. And don't think for a second that Iran wasn't involved in cultivating these relationships. So when Trump launches an operation, starts talking about running Venezuela, rebuilding oil infrastructure, these are not random statements. These are not random details. This is a tell. It's a strategic tell. It's an effort to prevent our adversaries a platform, and Trump has successfully cut off their access and influence in Venezuela, at least for now. Again, long term, I can't answer that. But I don't think people realize how significant a blow this was to Russia, to Iran, which appears to be on the brink of collapse, and to China. I mean, you look at it. Just look at Operation Midnight Hammer. Look at what's going on in Iran. It's a disaster. And now look at what took place in Venezuela. These were two major allies of Russia. So what you're witnessing right now is the Monroe Doctrine in action. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just look at the reaction from these foreign actors. You have this global outcry and condemnation from countries like China and Russia. They're not stupid. They know what the stakes are. They know what this signals. In one operation, Trump announced the hemisphere is no longer a free zone for them to operate in. And it signals that the Biden era projection of weakness is over, that the Biden foreign policy of don't is finished, that in its place is a doctrine of we will. But not only is it a doctrine of we will, it's going to be backed by action, not by warnings. You don't want to listen? Fine, there's consequences to that. So the era of adversaries expanding while we manage our decline, it's over at least for now. And I think people underestimate the energy aspect of this because Venezuela is not just another country with a socialist dictator. Venezuela sits on the resources that changes the strategic equation. They hold roughly the largest percentage of the strategic oil reserves, world oil reserves that exist out there. 18%, nearly 18%. Now that's power. That's power. The only reason Venezuela hasn't been able to exploit that power is because of socialism, right? Although that money right under their feet, they couldn't do it because socialism is always a disaster. Anything it touches, it fails. Just because you have the reserves, it doesn't mean that you can extract it and turn it into production. So Venezuela's oil sector has been devastated by mismanagement and lack of investment. I mean, again, I'll say it again, understand that everything socialism touches, it ultimately destroys. It's why Venezuela went from the wealthiest nation in South America to the poorest in such a short period of time. Now, President Trump made an announcement that American oil companies are going to be tasked to rebuild Venezuela's decaying oil infrastructure and boost their production. But here's why reserves still matter. Reserves are leverage. They are future capacity. They are the long-term pricing influence. And when you combine Venezuelan reserves with the broader energy position of the Western Hemisphere, with the Trump policies when it comes to energy, you start to see why this goes far beyond the idea of narco-trafficking. Energy dominance is not just about profit. It's about geopolitical power and pressure. If the United States can help bring significant supply back online in this hemisphere, over time, that changes the entire global energy dynamics. You have to understand that if you combine Venezuela and the United States, if you combine the oil reserve capacity, America has the potential to control over 20% of the world's oil reserves. And when we turn that into production, think about the enormous pressure it puts on OPEC and OPEC's ability to dictate terms. Think about who it hurts most. Think about how it hurts Russia. Think about how this is the area that Russia is most vulnerable. Russia's not a superpower because of its economy. Russia's a superpower because of energy and how it's been able to use that energy to coerce people, to fuel the Russian economy. And understand, Russia's power is deeply tied to energy revenues. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that you don't need to fire a shot at Russia to weaken Russia. You weaken Russia by forcing competition, by driving alternatives, by flooding the market with oil, and you do that by boosting productivity, especially in our hemisphere. This is why the oil infrastructure line matters so much. You know, when you look at the left that constantly wants to label Trump a Putin puppet, nobody has done more to hurt Putin than Trump has, whether it's the increased investments into NATO, whether it's strategic partnerships we've created throughout the world, whether it's getting the Middle Eastern countries to move away from Russia and China's sphere of influence back into our sphere of influence, and now we have Venezuela. And if the United States is serious about rebuilding that infrastructure, we're not doing it for a humanitarian gesture. Yes, the Venezuelan people will certainly benefit from that. I hope they do, and their lives definitely should improve. But it's a strategic move. It's a long-term play to reshape, leverage, strengthen America, and to improve the lives of Venezuelans so that we don't give them a reason to move back toward our adversary's sphere of influence. And this explains why our adversaries are not just upset, it's why they're outraged and also nervous. For the last several years, they were advancing on the world stage. They were expanding influence, and America was arguing with itself. America lost credibility, particularly during the Biden years. And it's funny because, you know, I went to one of those news websites. I don't know if it was Foreign Affairs, one of them. And they were like, President Trump just made the world more unstable by taking out Maduro. No, instability was increasing dramatically throughout the 21st century. I mean, when we look at it from 2005 up until 2024, with the exception of the first Trump term, we saw global instability increase dramatically. Then under the Biden years, it turned into a catastrophic disaster. You had the Afghanistan debacle. Nobody respected Joe Biden. They mocked him behind the scenes. And you look at the Biden administration's policies, just think about how they did everything in their power to get Lula of Brazil elected over Bolsonaro, and then Lula goes out there, tries to undercut the United States and the dollar's dominance as the world reserve currency, and it tells you everything you need to know about Biden's foreign policy. Yet today, 1 year since Trump came into office, America's adversaries are weaker today because they are being forced to react from the sidelines. They want to complain, but there's not much more they could do about it right now. And that's the strategic takeaway. That's what you have to pay attention to. Like I said in the previous segment, I'm not sitting there. I'm not declaring victory. I'm not cheering this on. I understand how this can all go sideways. What may be a gain today could turn out to be a disaster if we don't get everything right. I stated that there's no room for error, but we do have to look at the success, and we do have to look at where this goes. We also have to look at the domestic side of things because there are still a lot of questions. And whenever Trump does anything, you see the familiar pattern. You see foreign-aligned activists. You see these ideological groups. You see America's own professional protest class. They immediately frame it as illegitimate, right? Colonialism. It's criminal. It's immoral. They call for the ouster of Trump, right? They'll defend real dictators, and they'll serve as the useful idiots that benefit Russia and China. They'll defend a guy like Maduro as they accuse Trump of being a fascist. Truly amazing. All of a sudden, the left cares about sovereignty when the United States asserts its power and influence, but they care less when it comes to our own sovereignty, when we're being invaded. And that's why the outrage from the left is so predictable, because this operation, this new policy towards Venezuela, if it succeeds strategically, it will reverse years of adversarial gains in the hemisphere. It disrupts networks, it disrupts influence, it disrupts access to money supplies, changes everything. And anytime we do anything that's in our strategic interest, there are so many Americans that don't like it. They'll scream. They'll call it illegal. They'll call it imperialism. They'll call it fascism. They'll call for Trump to be impeached. Some will even call for his assassination. Truly insane they are. Now, with that being said, there are questions we do have to deal with. I'm talking about the legality, the constitutionality, claims about international law, the precedent, the limits of presidential power, all things I care about greatly. Because even if you agree with the strategic logic that I've been laying out so far, we still have to look at the question, what authority was used and what precedent does it set going forward? And I want to focus on that when we get back from a quick break. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So let's wrap it up in this last segment. We have to deal with the part that a lot of people are talking about, they're thinking about, and I'm talking about the legality of this type of operation. What's the constitutionality? Where does international law come into play? Let's look at the predictable domestic meltdowns that we're seeing from members of Congress, from the paid agitators that exist out there, because even if you think that the takedown was strategically brilliant, which I don't think anyone could argue that, we still have to answer a very basic question in a constitutional republic. And it shouldn't matter whether you support the President of the United States or you don't support the President of the United States. We do have to ask the question, what authority was this done? What does it mean going forward? We have to examine the constitutional reality. And unfortunately, I have bad news for everyone. As a political scientist who's been doing this for quite a long time, and it's murky. It's not just black and white. It's not easy to say whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional. It's not unprecedented. We've seen actions like these before, and it's not clean. The truth is that we sit in a constitutional gray zone, where this can be argued from multiple points of view. And it's not because the Constitution is silent on war and force. It isn't. It's pretty clear. Congress has the power to declare war. Congress has the power to fund the military. Congress has the power to regulate it. The president, as commander-in-chief, he's the one that's going to set the strategic objectives. He's the one that manages conflicts. Presidents take an oath to defend the United States and the American people, but that doesn't mean a president can do whatever the hell they want. However, this gray zone exists because of Congress, right? So all those people that want to come out and scream about constitutionality, well, let's be honest here. Congress has spent decades ceding real war-making power to the chief executive. Both parties are responsible for this. Both parties have benefited from this. You know, some in Congress, they want to feign outrage, but it's all political theater. They don't really care. Over time, what we have witnessed is a reality where major military actions are justified under a combination of Article 2 in the Commander-in-Chief's authority, claims of national interest, congressional input, existing authorizations that were passed by Congress, legal opinions by the Department of Justice that certainly stretched the Constitution to fit its mission and what it wants to do to keep expanding executive authority. It's not clean. It's not neat. It's not even pretty. I mean, think about it logically. The reason that President Trump moved to declare cartels as terrorist organizations is because it gives the president a lot more tools in his arsenal to combat these organizations. And Congress has allowed that to happen. I mean, just think about it logically. The authorization to use force against terror organizations was passed in 2001. There's been no modifications for it. It hasn't been brought up whether or not it should be reviewed. So if Congress doesn't like a president taking these actions, well, they have no one to blame but themselves. Okay, now that doesn't mean that everything a president does is constitutional, but it does explain why administrations keep doing it. I mean, just look at past precedents. Look at President George H.W. Bush, right? 1989, the invasion of Panama to seize Manuel Noriega. Noriega tied to drug trafficking, right? So it's important because Noriega, that case, I think, is the closest historical precedent to what we're seeing today. A foreign leader seized, brought to the United States for prosecution. It's not identical, but it is the closest. And this is why I keep saying that it gets murky constitutionally. I could build arguments on either side. I could cite precedents that say a president does have the authority to do this or a president doesn't have the authority to do it. You could point to previous administrations, but you can't pretend that there's some neat constitutional checkbox that makes operations constitutionally clean. I mean, look at Reagan, you had Grenada, Libya, Iran-Contra. You look at Bush in Panama. Clinton had Somalia, Kosovo, strikes in Sudan and Afghanistan. George W. Bush and how the war on terror authorizations expanded into a global permission slip, basically. You had President Obama oust Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi under what they called the limited intervention. You have President Obama deploying special forces in places like Uganda. I don't remember Congress having these debates. Okay, now the point isn't to relitigate every one of those. The point is to recognize a pattern, right? The modern presidency has accumulated enormous latitude when it comes to using force, when it comes to using the American military. And Congress has not only done little to try and stop presidential administrations from doing this, they've done nothing to reclaim their power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. When critics want to scream this is illegal, well, the truth is that no, it's not legal or illegal. It's murky. And when people do scream it's illegal, a lot of times what they really mean is, well, I don't like this president. They were awfully quiet when previous president did similar actions, when previous presidents pushed the same type of boundaries. When you hear people say it's 100% constitutional, well, no, you can't say that either. That's not factually correct. What you really mean is you like the outcome. Now, that's not how constitutional reasoning works. These are hard constitutional questions, and we should treat it like that. When it comes to international, I love when they bring up international law. I'm like, wow, they really know nothing. You know, people look at international law and they almost get religious, right? It's like its own sect of religion, international law. And the virtue signaling with international law always humors me. First of all, I will state it clearly, and I will state it once. Article 6 of the United States Constitution is what matters, not international law. You might not like that response, but that's the truth. The Constitution is explicit that the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So understand that international commitments that we sign on to in regards to treaties and stuff like that, they matter, they're important, they're part of the law of the land, and they matter in U.S. law. But they don't override the Constitution. And they are not enforceable in the way activists pretend that international law is enforceable. Secondly, and I think most importantly, let's face it, international law is more theory than anything else. It's in the eye of the beholder. It's whatever the superpowers want international law to be. Weaker nations violate what's deemed as international law. Well, the superpowers can come together. They could punish that nation. They could put enforcement mechanisms in place, and they could truly hurt that nation. If a superpower violates international law, it's a lot more difficult. The world doesn't like that we took Maduro out, that he's now facing prosecution here in the United States. Okay, what are they going to do to us? Are they going to slap sanctions on us? And who's that really going to hurt? Is it going to hurt us or them? You have to understand that superpowers can do what they want within reason. I'm not saying that we could just do whatever we want without consequence. Okay, I'm talking about within reason, and there's little that can be done about it. And that's the reality. International law, it matters as a framework. It matters for alliances and legitimacy, justifications, diplomacy. But the world isn't governed by theory. It's governed by power. And then you look at how people are reacting here in the United States, and it tells you everything you need to know about the state of American politics. You have Venezuelans in the streets celebrating. I'm talking about real people, real families, people who lived under the Chavez-Maduro regime, people that fled the Chavez and Maduro regime. They're celebrating the downfall of Maduro. Even those Venezuelans that don't like Trump are saying that Trump did a great thing. And then you have these mostly white progressive and their activist ecosystems doing what it always does. It's trying to dictate to Venezuelans, to Hispanics, to refugees, what they're supposed to feel. You know, the leftists love to virtue signal. And yes, these protests were not organic protests. They were organized, right? The Venezuelans coming on the streets, those were spur of the moment. Nobody thought that Maduro was going to be taken out like that. Nobody. And so those were the organic protests. But all of a sudden, you see these organized protests demanding that Maduro be freed. People condemning the operation, calling it a legal war. It wasn't a legal war. It was a 90-minute operation. They're trying to frame it as if it's imperialism. Now, again, the outrage isn't organic. We're talking about ideological organizations, Democratic Socialists of America chapters that are organizing protests, including one near Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York. You had the Democrat Socialists of America in L.A. publicly promoting a No War in Venezuela rally, explicitly claiming that the administration is using false allegations of drug trafficking to seize oil. No, Trump said we're going to use that oil. He didn't hide it. And the part that should make any normal person's head spin is that they're going to lecture you about protecting democracy while actively defending a guy like Maduro, running cover for a regime that's notorious for its brutality and repression. This is why it gets so frustrating, because you see the same people. Who do they defend? They'll defend illegal immigrants. They'll defend criminals. They'll defend human traffickers. They'll defend our adversaries. They'll defend real authoritarians and fascists, all because they hate Trump so much. That's why you get this bizarre political reaction where people who claim to oppose authoritarianism find themselves sympathizing with the authoritarians. okay, as long as it's in opposition to Trump. TDS is real. And the question that I find that's going to be the most important, what happens next and whether we can do something that we have struggled to do for decades. It's develop a coherent strategy that actually strengthens the United States, not weakens us, that actually works within America's interests, not the interests of the rest of the world. And that's the real test. That's the real test. We're going to see where this goes. There's going to be so much more to say on this topic, but I had to get it in because I think that fundamentally the world stage has been dramatically altered, and the United States may have just stopped the bleeding of its power and influence that we've been witnessing over the last several years. Now, on Wednesday, I am going to put out the Nick Shirley episode where I talk about the fraud in the Somali daycare centers and the billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars that's being scammed, money that you worked for, you worked hard for. So you're going to want to make sure you tune in. Everyone, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope your New Year starts off great, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com. And follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.